Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. This is a horror movie review and I'll be having a look at Dracula, specifically the 1979 version starring Frank Langella. Now obviously there's been countless films about Dracula, so I'm not going to harp on about the plot too much because obviously we've probably seen it 100 times already. Suffice to say that it follows the story of Count Dracula himself, who is a vampire, and his journey from Transylvania over to England, and there he meets kind of a female who is has a sort of deep connection with ultimately, and he's pursued by among other people Van Helsing, played by Laurence Olivier, and ultimately we've seen this kind of story, as I say, many times before. So that's pretty much all I'll say about it. So what makes this film maybe unique compared to its sort of contemporaries of its time? Now, as I said, I've mentioned previously, there's obviously a vast many Dracula films around this kind of in the 70s and sort of early 80s. Obviously, Hammer were probably the most prolific. But this one is, as I say, more of a Hollywood glitz sort of version of Dracula. It focuses a lot more on the kind of the sort of seductive side and the kind of the almost romantic side of Dracula, with less emphasis on the kind of the horror and that sort of thing. So this is all really driven by Frank Langella's performance as Count Dracula himself, who gives a kind of wonderfully seductive performance, and I think is really fantastic in the role, and really drives this movie. And he maybe comes across as a bit more of a well-rounded Dracula than even kind of Hammer films. Now I know some people may disagree with me about that, but I actually thought his Dracula had a little bit more depth to him, say, than some of the sort of Christopher Lee versions and stuff like that, who's more of just a kind of a 2D monster, I have to say. Now, on the subject of performances, one thing I'm not so keen on about this movie is actually the performances of Donald Pleasence and Sir Laurence Olivier, who I think are a little bit hammy and cheesy. I know it's probably heresy, because obviously they're two very well established actors and very well respected, but nevertheless, I thought they came across as a little bit crap in this film, I have to say. But because Frank Langella's performance is so good, and the kind of the absolutely fantastic sort of gothic mood setting they have here, I actually think he kind of makes up for it to some degree. Now, as I mentioned, maybe the other criticism that will be levelled against this film is kind of the lack of actual horror itself, and I think that's okay, because I think if they just kind of went for more of a straight horror movie, it kind of maybe would have just not been quite as memorable in its own terms. There are some pretty decent makeup effects, I have to say, here and there throughout the movie, and I actually would say even that they kind of hold up even in today's standards. They're not all the time, it's not something we see lots and lots of, but nevertheless, when we do see these kind of these more gross looking zombie vampire looks, they look pretty decent. But it's all about mood, this movie. It's all about sort of the setting, the kind of the way it's shot, the kind of, when Dracula, for example, there's a scene where he's kind of slowly sort of scouring the walls, and it looks really, really spooky, really atmospheric. And there's also, you've got a score by John Williams here, which I think is absolutely fantastic. It's not a piece of music that he's kind of necessarily remembered for, but nevertheless, he did a decent job in this movie, and I think it's worth remembering the score for this film. I actually quite like this film, I have to say, compared to a lot of other Dracula movies. Yes, it's getting a little bit old now, 1979, it is showing its age, and obviously you've kind of got some sort of 70s sort of styles and the haircuts and stuff like that, even though it's obviously meant to take place, I think 1919, I believe it's obviously meant to take place. But nevertheless, it's a decent Dracula film. It's a lot better than kind of some of the other sort of cheaper, even some of the more high budget and more high profile Dracula films, I have to say. This is one of my favourites. Nevertheless, I say not without its faults. I'm going to give it 8 out of 10. What did you think of it, and what's your favourite Dracula movie? Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.